Welcome to the Healthy Careers Podcast, where we help healthcare providers succeed on purpose. We take a conversational approach in learning from others who have been there and done that. Join us as we share expert insights from real people who are just like you, because we believe that success isn't just a destination. It's an intentional journey, and you don't have to do it alone.
All right, welcome back to the Healthy Careers Podcast. I'm your host, Madison Loomis, and today I'm excited to welcome Paul Neagle, who is the COO at OrthoCarolina. And I'm excited to talk to him because he is actually a PA that has transitioned, or has already transitioned for a while, into a C-level role. And so I want to go through the journey to that place, and also we're going to talk about a few different kind of rabbit hole topics that I think are just on a lot of people's minds recently. But first and foremost, welcome, Paul.
Madison, thank you very much. Honored to be here. Very excited to be on your podcast. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. So we had connected first on LinkedIn, and I thought that you had a really interesting background because it's not often that I come across people that are in COO roles or any C-level leadership position who have also spent 20 plus years as a clinician and as a PA in this world of healthcare. I think for a long time, leadership was often people who had only been in leadership or administrative roles and never really been patient facing. Okay, so tell us a little bit about your background, kind of just bird's eye view, how you got to where you're at now from where you started.
I started off as PA, finished up PA school in 2001, graduated from Wake Forest University, and was lucky enough that was the only place I really wanted to go. And so it was the one place I got into and started off there. And I spent the first 5 years as a PA working in private practice in the Atlanta area. I was in cardiology and then with an ENT group there. And my wife and I are both originally from Richmond, Virginia, and we had our two children when we lived in Richmond. And the family said, "Hey, we want you to be closer." So we moved up to Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Shortly thereafter, and I ended up, getting interested in the administrative side of medicine with one of the ER groups that I went to, began working with there in the Rockville, Maryland area. And was lucky enough to spend some time working with a small group. So at the time when I joined them, they only had 2 sites. And by the time I left, I think they had 14 different sites across, 3 or 4 different states. Mm-hmm. And so they were a progressive thinking, growing group. And the physicians really realized the benefit of having PAs and PA leaders. Mm-hmm. And so, I started off, just joining some committees and then became like the PA lead for like a location, and got involved with some leadership training that they were putting together for their physicians. And they had a couple of they had a nurse practitioner, a PA, who which was myself, and we were asked to join the group. And so we spent some time working with that group, and it was called Vistage. So it's a CEO kind of COO led type of leadership, training. It was, we met once a month for about 18 months. And then, you had the opportunity to work with kind of a one-on-one coach, which was kind of interesting, something I had never done before.
Yeah.
And they started asking me a little bit about, what did I think about the business side, and I was really interested in it at that point, because at that point I had done a couple of other things, some other leadership roles within the group, and was, really thinking about, okay, do I like what I'm doing? Which I love being a clinician. I'll be honest with you. The emergency department is not necessarily for the faint of heart, but it's also, it's never a dull moment. It's certainly a place where you see it all, and, you have a wide variety of practice there. But I really got interested in just the business of medicine and how medicine was working. I mean, and this was around the time of when the Affordable Care Act came out, and they were talking about different things. And, over my career, certainly I have seen other pieces of legislation come through or try to come through, with during, before I became a PA, during the Clinton years, and then, during, the Republican run that George Bush had. And then with Obama coming into the office, living in Washington, D.C. it's just an interesting place to live when you start mixing
Oh, I
politics and
bet.
medicine together.
Yeah.
Because everybody there talks politics. Not everybody wants to talk medicine, but then we were involved in the medicine, so we kind of mixed the two together as a
Right.
group. And obviously the emergency room is considered kind of the stopgap, in the American healthcare, the overall, American healthcare, paradigm.
System. Yeah.
And so really, we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this better? And I really got interested in, from that perspective in the business side. So decided to go back to school, decided to, work on my MHA, which is, my Master's of Healthcare Administration. And then I found a dual program through the University of Maryland system and did both an MHA and an MBA. And
I saw that. Yeah.
yeah, one day got in through the group in Maryland, I was able to work myself up to a director level. And, just through connections, I ended up in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the ER docs that worked there when I first started 8 years prior had left about a year into my tenure there. And I had kept in touch with him for about 7 or 8 years. Well, then he became a leader with a larger group for emergency medicine contractors for PAs, physicians, and nurse practitioners. And I met one of his colleagues at a conference and said, "Hey, how is Yogan doing?" And they said, "Well, he's doing great. He's now the regional president." I said, "Well, here's my card. I'd love to catch up to him. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years." He and I said, I don't know exactly where his email went, but if you happen to talk to him, have him give me a call. And he called me like a week later and said, "Hey, man, great to talk with you. You interested in moving to Charlotte? I need a VP of operations." I'm like, "Well, okay, explain more." So 45 days later, I sold my house, moved my family, and we trucked it on down to Charlotte, and we've been here ever since. So for the last almost going on 9 years now. So it's been great.
Okay. And when you made that jump, were you jumping completely out of the clinical side? So were you no longer doing anything patient care related, or did you kind of split your time at first?
I split my time. I was splitting my time with the group in Maryland, and I split my time when I came to Charlotte. I actually only stopped working in the emergency department 3 months ago.
Really?
So yeah, believe it or not. Yeah.
Wow.
Even as a COO for the first year, almost a year and a half, I continued to work in the emergency department. My time was obviously a lot less. When I worked with a company called Apollo MD. They're an independent physician group out of Atlanta. And I worked with them here in Charlotte. They had multiple different contracts, and I helped to manage those contracts and worked with a lot of the physicians. So, I spent a lot of time, working with those physicians and still worked in the emergency department with them and worked side by side with them. It was a lot of fun. And it was a passion. And then I spent 4 years with Apollo, and I will tell you, it was a great experience. That they're a fantastic group. I love the COO Amy that I worked with, and then obviously Yogan was the president. He just recently was promoted to the CEO, and so which is well deserved by him. And and we all still keep in touch, on a regular basis. But I got an offer to move up to senior VP with FastMed Urgent Care, which was a large urgent care company, and stay in Charlotte, but work across the state and run the state for them. So it's 56 clinics across the state. And it was more retail. So it did take me out of the emergency medicine realm from the standpoint of, and out of the hospital from the standpoint of an administrator from that perspective. But it put me into a totally and completely different realm of medicine from an administrative point of view, where you're more in the retail business. So now I had, leases to worry about, staffing, for 56 clinics. How do you manage all that? And then I joined them in November of 2019. And you can guess what happened in March of 2020. So March of 2020, the whole world stopped, right? And so that was a really interesting time, again, especially to practice medicine and be an administrator. But I still continue to work part-time in the emergency department, even though I was working for a different company. It just kept my clinical skills up. And it's something that I love. So,
I think that's something that a lot of people maybe shy away from leadership in a sense because it's like they're not ready to fully throw in their clinical hat, but they still
Yeah.
want to be able to move up the ranks, because I think what I found and what I know from people just in working in this space, and I talk to PAs and MDs all day, every day, is that, majority of them are type A personalities. And so you go to school, you work for the degree, you get into your job, and then a few years in, once you've mastered it, you're like, okay, now what? Right? Like,
Right.
I want to still be challenged. I still want to feel like I have that next step. And that's also been your world for the past 6 years, 7 years. So you almost have to chase that high, if you will, of that next accomplishment, that next achievement. But then a lot of people I've found also want it because they're burnt out from the clinical side, right? They went into a specialty or a role where there wasn't boundaries, or maybe they picked the wrong specialty. There's not a lot of passion in what they're doing, whatever it might be. And they're looking for an out. And it's like, it's not always, in my mind, that shouldn't always be your transition. Because when you move into leadership, now it's your monkeys and your circus, right? And
Right. Yeah.
you can't just say, well, my shift is over. You guys, good luck, And I think there's different stressors that come with a leadership role that you would never know until you are actually in that position. So,
Correct.
from your standpoint, I hear a lot of people complain about leadership as clinicians. And I think it's like any job, right? Nobody doesn't have a single thing to say about their boss and what they should do differently and how they view things.
Right.
um, but what was that mindset change for you? Or was there anything that maybe you realized, oh, I didn't see it from this perspective when I was a clinician, but now that I'm on the other side of the curtains, if you will, I can understand why some of these decisions were being made. Like, was there any point where you felt that switch?
Yeah, I think that with regards to kind of making the switch and how you felt on one side versus the other, I do
Hmm.
think that it has been incredibly beneficial and important for me as an administrator leader, in being in a leadership role to have the clinical background. I think
Yes.
that without a doubt, it gives me a different perspective than maybe what some other leaders have. And it is one thing that I have really encouraged my colleagues who don't necessarily have a clinical background, or who are maybe early in their career as either a PA or a nurse practitioner or even a physician who want to get into a leadership role. I've encouraged them to continue, if they can, in some way, shape, or form, to practice clinically, because I do
Hmm.
think that you I'd hope that in 17 years being an ERPA, I had somewhat mastered that
Yeah, I would say
specialty.
so.
I hope, I certainly, you know, from a standpoint of an administrator, I think that I have significantly grown over the years, but I've had to be patient.
Mm,
Um, and I will tell you that when a PA, nurse practitioner, or even a physician moves from, and it's a little easier for physicians, it's a little bit easier for nurse practitioners, because nursing really does dominate, and I'm not picking on them, my wife's a nurse, does dominate the leadership, especially within hospitals,
yeah.
and other healthcare organizations. If you have that clinical background, and majority of them are nursing,
Hmm.
whether it's from the payers, commercial payers, whether it's from auto insurance or auto insurance carriers. If you start looking at home health companies and all those different types of things, a lot of those leadership roles are filled by nurses,
Yeah.
even in the hospital setting. Um, but I think the biggest thing, when you move from being a clinician into the administrative role, that you have to keep in mind is that you're exactly right. Now you're working with a group of people,
Hmm.
and especially in operations, you have to be very nimble. You have to be out of the box thinking. You have to be a lifelong learner,
Yeah.
and and those skills that you have to gain in order to be, in my opinion, a good leader, are not always innate to you.
Mm,
They're learned. Um,
yeah.
I truly believe that all of us are born with leadership qualities. And I mean, just let's use surgeons for example. Okay,
Mhm.
I think that surgeons were born to be surgeons. They have the mindset, the tenacity. They have the, what do you want to call it, an attitude or ego. I mean, you got to have an ego. Okay,
Yeah.
And I think that honestly, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I think that
No.
honestly you have to.
Yeah.
But I also think that as leaders, we're all born with an innate bit of leadership within us. But just
Mhm.
like being a surgeon, where you had to spend many years, perfecting that trade
Mhm.
and being and practicing it. That's why they call it the practice of medicine,
Mhm.
or the art of medicine. I think that you also have to practice being a leader. And you're going to make mistakes, just like you are when you're a surgeon. You're going to make mistakes, and you learn so much more from your mistakes than you do your successes. But I
Yeah.
think that when you start to look in, okay, do I want to move to from this position as a clinician into a leadership role? You really have to understand. You have to change your mindset. You have to, and that's what I did. It was not an easy transition, I'll be honest with you. As I mentioned, I just stopped practicing clinically for 3 months, but I probably agonized over it for 2 years,
Yeah.
because I spent so many years not only in PA school learning my craft, but I spent so many years just trying to be a better clinician, trying to help people. That was, whether you call it, whether it's a calling or whatever you want to call it. Um,
Mhm.
I really, felt like when I saw, either patients in private practice or when I moved into the emergency department, they were there, and I didn't particularly care what they were there for. They could be there for something that was so small, but to them, it was their emergency. And,
Yeah.
and, and some of my colleagues really laugh at that, and I'll take that one. But I will tell you that I felt like, if I could provide some help, some comfort, whether it
Mm.
was just because you're very anxious over what's going on with you, or you feel that it's a burdensome point in your life. I may not necessarily be able to cure it, but if I could somehow, some way make a little bit of difference for you, that's what I
Right.
was there for.
Right.
But when you go into the administrative role, you don't quite get that same type of feeling back, right?
Yeah.
Because now you're
You're the bad
now
guy.
you're affecting it in a different way. So in my roles as a from a leadership, how I've really looked at it is I'm now looking at it from a much broader level, from maybe more of a 30,000, 50,000 foot level. And
Mhm.
every step you go up, you kind of look at it a little bit higher, a little bit broader.
Right.
Um, and now you're being able to help more people. So, I mean, OrthoCarolina sees about 1.2 million patients a year, patient visits a year.
Wow.
And so I look at it now that I'm trying to shape a company that provides care to 1.2 million people. I can never do that as a
As just as clinician.
single
Yeah.
clinician. I may see 30 people in a shift times
Mhm.
however many days I worked. And there was a finite amount of good that I could potentially do.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I look at it, from that's kind of the perspective that I took with it. But I will tell you that it not every, and I truly believe this too, not every good clinician or great clinician can be a good administrator.
Yeah.
And not every administrator necessarily is a great clinician. So you really have to work at it.
I think what I found in my own experience too is that when I started my business, it was also a huge transition for me because I had worked both corporately as an internal recruiter with places, whether it was a hospital or an organization. And then I'd also worked externally in staffing. And when I opened up my own agency, it was really hard to switch that mindset because I had led teams and I had, been responsible for other people's performance to a certain degree, but I had been so used to just being responsible for my own stuff, right? Like I was a top performer and as long as I was hitting my metrics and I would track it, I was good. And it's this understanding that now it moves from almost like a tactical approach to a strategic approach of, am I doing things in the best and most efficient way possible? Am I also empowering the other people on my team to do the same in the most digestible and best manner without being a micromanager and without being rude and without having an ego? And it's so like you have to put on so many of these filters when if it was just me doing it, like I just bang it out and it's done, right?
Right.
And I think that's what I think some people struggle with is that they could be a really, really great clinician. They could be the best clinician that they know, and they're the leader on the team. And when something complex comes up, it's like, oh, give it to that person. They'll be able to handle it. but then you put that in a position to have to manage their coworkers, and they might not have the communication style, or they might come across. I mean, how many times have we heard this orthopedic surgeon's kind of difficult to work with, right? But as you said, they kind of have to be because of what they're doing, number one. And this is kind of a rabbit hole thing, but I also think too that a lot of surgeons, it's like that fake it till you make it type of mindset of, there's a lot of what's the word, like imposter syndrome, I think, that goes on with people feeling like they can't do something. And I have friends that are orthopedic surgeons that are like, yeah, like when I started, I didn't know if I was doing things right. But you've got to believe that you are, so that when you show up, and I think that's a lot of times where the ego comes from, is like the overcompensation for what they're really feeling inside.
No, I'll tell you a funny story if you like stories.
Yes.
I had when I was living in Maryland, where I practiced the majority of time in the emergency department was very close to where I lived.
Okay.
And that's the first time I had ever really done that. And I would go like to a local department store, and somebody would come up to me in the department store at random and say, "Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you again. You saw me in the emergency room. Do you remember me?" And of course my answer was yes. No idea. Right? I mean, and the only thing I thought about really, Madison, at that point was, okay, thank goodness that person's doing okay.
Yeah.
And because it's like, okay, they survived the visit with me. Right. And I mean, I said that jokingly to myself, and my wife and I would be together, and she's like, "Do you remember that person?" I'm like, "No idea." But she's like, "Well, you talk to them." I'm like, "Yeah, because I don't want them. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want them to think I don't know who they are." Right. Because I think that was the only downside, I think, to working in the emergency department, in my opinion, was not having the continuity of care. I mean, when I practiced in private practice, my first two years, it was, I knew the people because I would see them fairly, frequently.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of continuity of care with that.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing too. I've got friends who are nurses in the ER and, or PAs or whatever. And they're like, I mean, it's just fast paced. Whereas if you look at other specialties, a lot of times they're seeing the same people, whether, if they're in an orthopedic clinic and they're coming in for their PRP injections or whatever else. And you do see a lot of the same people. But yeah, I think there's a lot just from that healthcare perspective of making that switch from just being responsible for your patients to now being responsible for the outcomes of patients that you're not even seeing. But you have a team of people that are seeing them, and they need to make sure that, patient satisfaction rates are good and that people are coming back and they're happy with what they're getting. And I think that's a whole new element that mindset shift you don't think about as a clinician. And it's so easy to pass judgment each way until you've actually experienced both seats. And I think that's why I love seeing the shift that so many more places are hiring and promoting clinicians within to sit at the table and have that seat to say, hey, actually, we need to do this because as a clinician, I understand that this is what's going to make the change, or this is what's going to improve this or that.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, that's kind of how I got started in the administrative side, was asking to sit at the table.
Yeah.
And, and I think that's so important because, you mentioned earlier that you hear a lot of your clinician friends say that they get frustrated with leadership. I also encourage leaders to get out into the clinic or get out onto the floor so that they can see exactly what's going on. However, I do think that as clinicians, we also need to have a seat at the table. Yeah. And, the old saying is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I always recommend that the best way to really get involved and to understand why leadership sometimes make the decisions that they make, or to really be part of the solution, is to get involved and sit down and lean into those difficult conversations that you're having with, or lean into those difficult problems and have the conversations that you need to have in order to then come up with a solution that works best for everyone. Because again, if, the administration sometimes, and I'm not saying this is right, because there's a lot of people who do it, they're looking at it from a numbers. They're looking at maybe an Excel spreadsheet or a some type of data that's coming out of their EHR, they're
Mhm.
not necessarily understanding exactly why that data is the way it is. And a
Right.
lot of times the clinicians can be doing more on their side to help make that data look better.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's very little and subtle things. So I think when you get the two together and get them talking, that is really where the magic happens in the healthcare system.
Yeah.
And, there's there's no doubt in my mind, and I know that the the government, being in healthcare, has certainly gotten its fair share of opinions from those outside of the government and outside of healthcare. But I will
Yeah.
tell you that healthcare will never uh, be better without having involvement from clinicians across all, physicians, PAs, nurse practitioners, nurses, physical therapists. I mean, pharmacists, you name it. You could run the spectrum of the different types of specialties and different types of roles that are in healthcare. It's never going to
Yeah.
get better unless you have all those folks getting to the table and really
Yeah.
hashing out these different problems.
I think that's kind of a general concept, and that's why for healthcare, I think for so long it wasn't that way, and I'm so glad it is moving that way because you think of any other business scope. My parents were teachers, and it used to drive them nuts when somebody would come and sit in their classroom and judge them with a little notepad. And they were somebody that worked for the government from the state. They'd never been a teacher in their life. So they were just working off of a rubric. And so there's so much room for gray area to be able to say, well, what are you judging me on? Right? Like, you've never been in this classroom. So how could you possibly know what you're looking for? Or, trying to think of another example in my own business, I've looked for coaches and mentors just because I think that's important. And so many of these people will reach out to spam you and they're like, oh, I can coach you. I can show you how to do this and that. And I'm like, okay, have you owned your own recruitment agency? Well, no. I'm like, I'm not interested in working with you then because you don't understand, right? And you can
Right.
always seek to understand and seek to listen. And I think so many people fail at getting to the leadership level because of what you said. I think you hit the nail on the head with that, is having difficult conversations, because you can either be a transactional clinician where you come and go to work and then that's it until you move to your next job, or you can look at the data and help them to interpret it, like to say, oh, okay, this data, I understand that you guys are looking at it from the business or the operational front, but here's what I see and here's how I think we can make it better. And I talked to somebody who's a director of advanced practice, and he said a lot of times that extra work is unpaid. And you've got to be willing to do all of that research, but present it to earn that seat at the table to say, hey, look, like, I want to be involved. I want to advocate. And I know what I'm talking about. But I think so many people shy away from that either because they think it's not their place, or they just don't want to have that kind of difficult conversation that they feel like their job's going to be on the line or something like that.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, in whoever that was incredibly, had a lot of foresight there, because I will tell
Yeah.
you that that's probably when I mentioned earlier when we were talking before we started recording,
Hmm.
a little bit about my career. That's the one thing that I realized early, that in order for me to move up in leadership, I had to do things that were necessary, or necessarily, excuse me, that I wasn't going to get compensated for, like I did as a clinician.
Yeah.
Uh, and honestly, part of the reason why I continued to work as, both an administrator and as a clinician in Maryland and in North Carolina when I moved here, is in order to kind of keep my salary, and keep
Yeah.
my pay where it was when I was a PA. And I know that when some people hear this, they're gonna think that that's really strange. So why did you step out of being a PA and you were getting paid X to get paid less to be an administrator? Well, it was an opportunity. It was where I saw that, hey, this is what it's going to take for me to get into the administrative side.
Hmm.
Because as a physician assistant, or physician associate, I don't want to irritate some of my colleagues because we have changed the name, but I'm old school, so
Yeah.
I will tell you that I'll just use PA because I still like the assistant
Yeah.
piece, even though I know that the academy has changed the name. Um,
Hmm.
I will tell you that the I did that because I knew that as a PA, they're able to bill for my services. So I'm a widget maker, right? When I'm an administrator, I'm an
Mm,
investment to the organization. I don't consider myself necessarily to be overhead, but I'm not a widget maker
right.
from a, it's more of a soft ROI,
Yeah,
return
you
on
can't really
investment as opposed to a
calculate.
hard return on
Yeah.
investment.
Yeah.
I could take a PA working in the emergency department, or we can even use orthopedics since that's where I am now. I can
Mhm.
take a PA and I can tell you that where we will, as a company, break even on them and
Mhm.
where we will pay for their salary throughout the year. Because
Right.
I know how many patients they need to see based on the amount of money that we get per patient, like, average office visits that come in,
Mhm.
or average surgeries that they do, based on our current payers that we have. And I can pretty close, we can determine, okay, if you hire this PA now, this is how long it's going to take before that PA pays for him or her,
Right.
themselves. Um, as an administrator, that's a lot harder. And so that then
Yep.
becomes, you have to then understand that that hospital or that company is now making an investment in you as a leader. And that investment, in some cases, can have a little bit of a shelf life. I mean,
Mhm.
depending on how well you perform or how well the company performs. So it is, for me, you have, that's part of the reason why I stayed working as a clinician, because I wanted to, number one, I wanted to keep my salary where it was. I didn't really want to take a
Right.
pay cut. But also, um, it allowed me to continue to have the camaraderie, it allowed me to continue to see exactly what was going on, to really understand the operations with the team, um, at the level that I was working at as an administrator. And,
Mhm.
it continued to, and so that's what part of the reason why I continued to do it up until about 2 or 3 months ago. So.
Yeah. And I think so let me ask you this, why did you decide finally that, okay, we're done with the clinical side? You just felt like there was more work to do on the other end, or
Yeah, I think, honestly, from my perspective, I was not working enough shifts per month that I really felt that
Mm,
it it warranted the time away from my family. The job that I have now is not a 40-hour a week job. It is,
sure.
it's more demanding than that. I do some travel. I've traveled a lot more in my career. When I was in Maryland, I traveled a lot with that group, um,
Mhm.
and more so than I ever do now. But now that we've gotten more into normal operations and we're through COVID,
Mm,
it just got to a point where I felt that in order for me to be able to keep up with it and be able to continue to do it well, I need to be doing it more. And so I
yeah,
decided to
yeah,
to just step back from it. At some point, I am going to probably do something different. I don't know what that's going to look like yet from a clinical standpoint, but
yeah,
I do want to continue to practice. Because, as I mentioned, I truly enjoy it. Like, I enjoy seeing patients. I enjoy talking to them, understanding kind of what's going on with them. So.
yeah. Maybe telehealth, something
Yeah,
that
I
you could
mean,
do from
could
home,
be.
you
Yeah,
know?
I mean, there's all kinds of options out there. That's the other great thing, in my opinion, about being a PA, is that you get trained in either
Mhm.
primary care or internal medicine, and then you can specialize
Yeah,
and
pretty
you
much
can
anything.
reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
You truly can. If you find a physician in a group that's willing to help you reinvent yourself, you truly can.
Mhm.
I mean, my specialties in my career have been cardiology was my first 2 years. I did 3 years of ear, nose, and throat, and
Mhm.
otolaryngology, and I did 17 years in emergency medicine. So, um, and I actually
Yeah.
had people tell me that, hey, it's going to be really hard for you to get back in emergency medicine after being a PA for 5 years and away from, not
More
doing
of
it
like a
originally. And
specialized, yeah.
yeah, I found a group that was willing to help me learn.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I searched for when
Mm.
I was trying to get into a different specialty, was to try to find a group that was willing to help me learn.
That's a big thing too, I think. I talk to a lot of people that are either in that similar boat that you were in, where they specialized right out of school, and or they stayed pretty broad after school, or they're in the position to decide what they want to do, right? And I actually
Hmm.
interviewed somebody that went, I think, directly into trauma surgery or something out of school. And I've got my opinions on it personally from a recruitment and a branding standpoint. From what I know, I think if you go into something that's more specialized like you did, you have a little bit more of an edge, right? Because if you can do cardiology, why wouldn't you not be able to do anything else, right? If you went into a niche, something that required additional learning, well, then you can do it again with something else. And that's the beauty of being a PA. So I laugh when so many places are like, oh no, we won't hire that person coming from a very ortho adjacent position doing very similar clinical things because they haven't done ortho. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Sure. But they're, a tenured PA and they're more than capable. And so it's always interesting that conversation with people as to why or why not changing things up after X amount of years.
That happened to me.
Yeah.
That happened to me. I'll be honest with you. When we moved to Maryland, I tried to get a job with the group that I ended up spending the most time with in Maryland, which was the group that I left to come to Charlotte.
Okay.
And they wouldn't hire me. They said that I didn't have enough experience, even though in my experience prior to becoming a PA I was a national registered paramedic, worked for a high volume system. I was an athlete trainer. So and I did cardiology and ENT. I mean, I was, I had just about every type of specialty that you see in the emergency department, especially the more, if you were to put me in a fast track, I mean, I was a fast track dream,
right.
That's
a transferable skill set.
I originally knew when I first started in emergency medicine. And, I ended up working for another group and was there about a year and a half, and then went, was interviewed by the group that I tried to get a job with first. And they're like, so they were asking me a question and they said, well, do you have any questions for me? And I literally gave it back to them. You'll love this as a recruiter. This is not great. Probably you don't want to give this advice to any of your clients. But I said, so why should I come work for you guys when y'all rejected me a year and a half ago?
Right.
And they're like, what are you talking about? And so I told them the story and they're like, are you kidding? And I'm like, no. And so, I don't know. I mean, they obviously hired me, but I wasn't really trying to torpedo that interview, but I was, I guess, trying to just, I was trying to be serious about it, just to say, okay, you guys want me to come work for you, but why should I?
Right.
And I don't know, maybe that was the edge that got me hired over somebody else. Who knows? But
no, I love that approach. I 100%. And I think about talent acquisition probably very differently than most agency recruiters, just because of my background and that I've been internal. So I understand the way people are thinking and how they're looking at it from a budget standpoint. And also from a clinician standpoint of like, it's a two-way street. Like you've both got to make it work and it has to be beneficial for both parties. And I think before COVID, it was kind of like just driven by employers, right? And it was
Totally.
this kind of game of, well, why should we hire you? And now it's kind of flipped where it's like, why should I come work for you? When I've got all these other opportunities. And I remember kind of short story, long story, but one of my clients now that I do a lot of HR consulting with and hiring, the woman who tapped me on the shoulder there was my boss when I was 18 or 19 years old. And in that interview, they asked me all these questions. And I said, I don't know. I said, but I'm a really hard worker and I will show up early and stay late if that's what it takes to get this done. And at the end of the interview, they kept asking me all these questions about my background and I didn't really have it. I was young. This was one of my first corporate jobs. And I said, so why did you all work here? Like, where did you guys all start? Because you had to start somewhere too. And I think it allowed them to kind of psychologically go back to when they were in my spot and go, oh, someone took a chance on me, right? Somebody saw me sitting here on the other end of the table and let me not get too comfortable with where I'm at now. And I've had a relationship with her now for 10 years and she's my client 10 years later when I opened my business. So I think it all goes to show the power of pushing back on kind of the standard of what questions should you ask in an interview or how should you approach an interview, because it is a two-way street.
Oh, I agree. Prior to me coming on with OrthoCarolina, the group that I was with, I had 13 interviews to get that job. Separate ones.
Wow.
Yeah, with that same company, 13 different individuals from that company. Now, let me rephrase.
I need to talk to you about your strategy there.
Yeah, no, it was interesting, right? I thought after like the sixth or seventh, I'm like, am I doing something wrong? But then
Yeah.
they kept asking me back, and I'm like, okay, well, I must be doing something right. But it. I remember I had there. Honestly, out of the 13, there was a couple of people that I met more than once. But it
Okay.
started off with the HR person, and then kept blooming from there. But by
hmm
the time we got to 6 or 7, I was interviewing them just as much as they were interviewing me. Because
Right.
I'll be honest, that for me was a stretch. That was not a comfort zone for me. And I would tell anyone who's listening to this podcast that sometimes in leadership, you do have to you have to go outside of your comfort zone if you want to grow.
Yeah.
And very much you need to do that. And you have to then take chances, what I like to call calculated risks as a leader. And you have to take these chances to get yourself to use different skills that maybe you wouldn't be able to get in the current role you have, or if you stayed maybe with that organization, it may take you years to get to. So
Yeah.
because you would have to either get promoted up, or you would have to maybe take a different path.
hmm
So when I became the VP of operations, senior VP of operations for FastMed, it was moving out of a VP of operations role that I had been in for 4 years, and then moving into this totally different role. But I was using more of my MBA. I was doing more with, the profit and loss. I was looking at more of our financial statements than I was with the other group. I was
hmm
having to deal with leases. I was having to deal with liability insurance. I was having to deal with more staffing. So it was we built a EMR from the ground up. Those were things that
Yeah.
I knew were coming up, that where I knew would be a challenge for me, but that would help me down the road.
Right.
And it surely has with the job that I got with OrthoCarolina, because they just recently went to the same EMR and had built it up and brought me in to kind of help. Okay, how do
Yeah.
we optimize this and operationalize it? So there is, but if I hadn't taken that role, and I'll be honest with you, the first question I asked the recruiter when she called me, it was a cold call from a recruiter. That's how it started.
Okay.
Um,
Love
through
it.
LinkedIn, by the way. She goes, "Hey, are you interested in this?" I'm like, I don't know. I've been a ERPA for 17. At that time it was probably like 13, 14 years. I said, I don't know. I've been doing this that long. I don't really know if I want to do urgent care. Like, it's really not my cup of tea. I'm like, okay, will I have to move, and do I have to change my phone number? And I was kind of joking with her, right?
Yeah.
And she goes, no. And I said, perfect. I'm like, what
Why
else you
not?
got? What
Yeah.
else you got? And so we started talking, and that's just how it just was a conversation. And I don't know. Again, I wouldn't necessarily offer that kind of advice to folks if they were really looking for the interview, but I think it goes back to or if they're
hmm
really looking to get the job, to use that as an interview a tactic. But for me, I was just really being real with her,
Yeah. Yeah.
and honest. And I think that they appreciated that.
Yeah.
And everyone I met from that group, I was just trying to be as real and as honest as I could be. Then they
hmm
asked some pretty difficult questions. They asked me, hey, what kind of leader are you?
Right.
What would you do in this situation? I remember one of the questions I got from the CEO was, what book are you reading right now?
Mm.
And, I was reading. I was, and he and I talked a little bit, and he actually was familiar with the books that I read. So you have to be careful with that too. You can't just pull
Yeah. You
something
start tossing
out
out
of your
like names
head,
of political
and
books or
hope that they
such.
don't read it. Right. So you have to be really careful with your answers. So I think ultimately just being real and, upfront with your questions, just being
hmm
genuine with your answers, and,
Yeah.
for lack of a better way to describe it, speaking from the heart,
Yeah.
is to use a person is really the best tactic to take. So,
100%. I think what is made for you will always come to you, and people will come to me.
mhm,
And one of the number one questions, right, is about job hopping. And a lot of people are so nervous about what their resume looks like. And you touched upon this point a little bit earlier about, well, in my mind, it really depends, right? Like if your goal is to get to X, Y, and Z, and you are not going to have the opportunity where you're at now, but this making this jump would provide you with that opportunity, well, then I would argue that that's a strategic, smart move. The problem is that so many people are just making a jump to the same position for 5 and 10 grand more a year.
right, yeah,
And so it's like, well, okay, but couldn't you have just asked for that in your current role and proven by performance that, or advocated for yourself to say, hey, boss, I really foresee myself going into a lead type of position, or I'd like to take on some type of role where I'm, like you said, willing to take on some more things that maybe are uncompensated at first, but eventually lead to me proving my ability to do X, Y, and Z. And so many people just aimlessly go out. And so when I talk to people and recruit people, if they're like, I'm happy where I'm at, I'm like, okay, so what's next steps there? And they're like, well, there is none. I'm like, okay, so you're happy for now. How about a year from now? Right? And they might say, oh, I actually have a promotional track here. Well, great, perfect. There's no need for us to talk. Here's my number. Give me a call if that changes or if that doesn't, come to fruition. But I think so many people get so hung up on just the resume dates or whatever else versus, like you're saying, having those very authentic, real conversations of like, hey, if this doesn't serve me, I'm not really interested. And it doesn't mean that you can't reach out to me for the next opportunity, but it just means right now it doesn't work. Or it could become something where it's the next best thing for your career and you're open to the conversation and it does provide you with that next step. So I think that's incredible how you got to where you are now without it being this like super, forced thing.
Yeah, and you're gonna laugh when I tell you this. The OrthoCarolina job, and I didn't tell them this at the time when I was interviewing because I felt like that would probably not be, it'd be frowned upon. But I'll be honest with you, when I saw the OrthoCarolina COO job come up, I looked at my wife. I'm like, I had the computer in my hand. I said, hey, check this out. I'm like, this would be kind of cool. I was like, all right. I hit the button, send in my resume. I mean, literally, that was my approach to it. And and I'm like, I'm probably not going to get this, but let's give it a shot.
Right, anyway. Yeah.
I mean, I had the credentials, but you never know what they're looking for. I mean, I'm an emergency medicine PA who now runs one of the largest orthopedic groups in the country as a COO. Now it's owned by the physicians. So when I say I run the day-to-day operations.
Right,
the physicians own it. But I really went into that, when I got the interview, I was like, holy crap, this actually has the potential here for me to do this. This would be awesome, and then as it, I got the next interview and I'm like, okay, like you got to like bring your A game to this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But going back to what you were talking about before, I think is a really important point. And this is what I try to teach. I work with some students at some local colleges, and I've worked with other people who are looking, and none of them are clinicians. They're all like in an MHA program, or they're, finishing, they're part of, so I'm a fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives. I went through that and got my fellowship, and I like to give back with that as much as I can. And so I work with the different colleges, and they have student organizations that are part of the American College of Healthcare Executives. And I recently had a meeting with a group of students, and we just kind of sat. They came up to my office, and we had dinner one night. We just sat there and we just kind of talked about, hey, healthcare. We just kind of like this. We just shot the breeze for a couple of hours. It was great. And they asked me questions like, how did you get from here to here? What was the secret? There really isn't a secret. I think that some of it is luck, right? I think some of it is patience. And patience, I think, is the key. Because, a couple of them were saying, well, hey, what kind of leadership roles do you have that maybe are coming open here in OrthoCarolina at the time? And we currently still have it. It's a VP of operations role that I'm looking for for our organization. And I remember one of the students who she's graduated, she's in a role, she's working with a great company. She's, I think, either at a manager or director level already, and has her master's in healthcare administration. And she said to me, she's like, yeah, I'd love to get to that next step. I'm like, well, send me your resume. So she sent me her resume. She's only been in that role for 6 months at a director level, right? So what I'm looking for with that VP of ops level, I want somebody who's had a director level or, for about 5 years.
Right.
And that's what I mean by patience. Like you were talking about, skipping to go to 5,000 or 10,000 more. Yeah. I think it's totally fine for you to go into your organization and say, hey, look, I'd like to sit down and reevaluate my salary. Can we have that conversation? Now, if you've only been there 90 days, probably not the time to do that. Right. However, if you've been there for a couple of years and you're not just somebody who, like you said, just shows up to work. Yeah. Because a lot of people say, well, I do a lot of great things. Well, okay, tell me what you do. Because we have a pay for performance process at our organization. And it starts off with like meets expectations, right? The next one
Right.
is exceeds expectations or really exceeds expectations. I forget what the last one is. It's exceeds and then something like super exceeds or whatever. And, a lot of people get upset with me. They're like, well, why am I only meet expectations? And I'm like, well, tell me what you did this year that feel like would get you to that next level.
Right.
You're like, well, I'm always on time for work. I don't call out sick. I'm like,
you and everybody else.
that's what you're supposed to do.
That's kind of
right?
a given.
Like that's the job. Like the job is showing up, doing your job, right?
Yeah.
If you want to go above that, then you need to do some of those things like what you talked about. And I'm, by all means, I'm not asking people out here to get out here and, work themselves, to
right
death.
into the ground. Yeah.
Where you're working 100 hours a week and not being compensated for it. And they just keep piling and no one ever says thank you. They don't recognize that. But you become, get on a committee, become part of a project.
Right.
They give you something, make sure you hit it out of the park. Like, don't just do it halfway where they're always on you. You're not meeting deadlines, all those types of things. But I think there are some thought processes out there with different individuals that think, hey, I showed up to work on time. I never called in sick. Yeah, you did a great job. You did the job we hired you to do. But they're like, I deserve a big bonus for that. And that's where I mean leaning into those difficult conversations as a leader that you really have to be prepared for, because sometimes I've frustrated some folks at times, and I'm like, I hear you. I know you want to make it to the next level, but this is what it's going to take, if you want to get there.
I think there's a divide between upcoming and younger generations with that mindset.
Yeah.
And then people that have been in the profession and understand the reality behind it is that the newer generations, and I face this with recruiting, and I'm like, I just don't get it. Like, people that can't communicate properly, people that want $100, and $50,000 right out of school, and you try to talk logic to them, and it's like they've just been told they're the greatest thing since sliced bread since the time that they could talk, and everything has been an instant gratification to where they've never had to have patience for anything. They never had to work really hard at something over a consistent amount of time before they were able to say, okay, now let me go to bat for this next step. And so I think that's also a huge part of why there's a lot of like compression happening internally with new hires versus people that have been there. And it's something from an HR and a talent acquisition strategy standpoint that I find is a huge challenge for operation, because it's, it's just an ever-growing battle between like, oh, well, you're not giving me what I want, so I'm just going to go jump and take 10 grand somewhere else. And it's like,
no,
okay.
100%. I have definitely had to change my leadership style with the different generations that I manage. I have some people that I manage have been there 25, 35 years, and others have only been there 2. And, I'm old enough to be their father. Right. So it's a huge difference. And, so it's one of those things where you really, as a leader, you have to understand the generational differences that are out there and really understand exactly what you said. There's some instant gratification, and I'm not picking on the everybody gets a trophy, type of mentality, but there's something to say about that. And unfortunately, my generation growing up, you didn't have smartphones. You didn't have,
right.
I'll never forget my son asking, well, Dad, how did you get a date? And I'm like, you called her on the phone. Right. There's no texting, right? You prayed that the father didn't answer. Right. So, but there's no texting, there's no Instagram, there's no Facebook. So I didn't grow up with those things. So now that all this stuff is out there, it is definitely a different way that you have to be able to manage and understand that. And I think that honestly, what you have to do is you have to bring in team members that have a variety you have some variety in their ages in order to help you understand and work through that. Because it is definitely, and you have to be open-minded. Oh my gosh, you got to listen and be very open-minded. But definitely, in my generation too, we have problems. We have folks that have been doing this as long as I have, and they're like, I'm not changing.
Right.
They don't want to do change, right? Whereas the younger generation is very agile. they're used to change.
Yeah, they
they'll
can
change
zag a lot
jobs
easier.
sometimes for, especially in the healthcare field, for like $1 or two per hour. And I think that in healthcare, you're seeing a lot of compression right now because there are where I am. I do have people that have been there 40 years. We have some
Hmm.
incredible tenure, which is just a testament to the company
Culture.
itself.
Yeah.
Um, However, I think that in culture, I think the other thing that you're seeing though is you're seeing a lot of compression in healthcare because just of the wage wars that we recently had coming out of COVID.
Yeah. COVID messed
Healthcare,
everything up.
and not many people are talking about the shortages of nurses, doctors, clinical assistants, medical assistants,
Mm,
CNAs, and so I think that these wage wars are going to continue.
yeah.
I mean, a local healthcare system here just raised their minimum wage to $17.50. That's their minimum wage. So it's very difficult when you
Yeah.
have two big healthcare systems in the same city and you're trying to compete with the same personnel. There's only a finite number of people that are in healthcare. And so it
Yeah.
becomes very difficult in order to be able to keep them.
Yep.
And
And
so
I
you have
think,
to find ways to be unique.
yeah, I think specialties are not seeing it as much, but I think it's going to continue to grow that way because it's just kind of like this bell curve of, I think, primary care and, places where I remember hiring CNAs at $12 an hour.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen anymore.
Nope.
That's not a thing. And it's just gonna continue to grow because it's like even in the specialties, yeah, people are moving more towards that way. And I think my take on it is it all stems from just the cost of education, why there's not more support around programs for people that want to be healthcare providers to be able to go to school to where they're not graduating with $200,000 in debt, to where they need a job that pays them X amount to be able to do that. Because that's the number one pushback I get is it's like, hey, I love this job. It's everything I ever wanted, but I'm staring down a bill of $1,000 a month for a student loan. If I'm not making
Yeah.
X amount, I can't afford to live on my own and have an independent lifestyle. And I say that from more of the PA, NP, and MD level than that of MAs, but still, I think it's just the ever growing cost of living and schooling, and then the aftermath of that is what we're seeing now, where it's like PAs that have absolutely no experience saying that they want 160 grand, and I'm like, huh?
Yeah.
Do you understand the math
Yeah.
behind that of how that works? Because the math ain't mathin'.
No. I mean, certainly there are groups out there. A couple of my colleagues got really lucky. I mean, I remember there was one guy who was a year ahead of me, and he convinced the group that he was working with to completely repay his school loans. But he was very much in the minority. You know,
Yeah.
and I've heard of PAs moving. Like you said, for different amounts and maybe a better lifestyle. But I also think that, I also have colleagues that have been in the same role for 23 years.
Yeah.
They've worked for the same group and they love it and they
Right.
wouldn't have it any other way. And so I think that ultimately it's, like I said, the PA profession is awesome. I love it. I think that there's a reason why it's one of the number one, jobs,
Jobs.
healthcare
Yeah.
jobs in has been for many years. And, I would encourage anyone who wants to do it. I would tell you though that PAs are slowly and surely starting to get into leadership.
Mm.
I've definitely seen it increase more over the last 5 to 6 years than it ever has been.
Yeah.
But they're also, we have to remember as healthcare workers and colleagues that, again, not throwing nurses under the bus, but they have a huge lobby.
Yeah.
In the state that I'm in, they actually regulate the nursing board. Now, whether it was the board or not, but the state legislature basically says you have to be a nurse. Nurses have to be led by nurses. Like I could never go in and lead a group of nurses as a PA.
Right.
You have to be a nurse in order to lead nurses, and so that's where some of that stems from. Where nurses have really cornered the market when it comes to leadership roles within hospitals because
Yeah.
of state
Of that.
legislatures and organizations. So, yeah.
Yeah. I've also found too that I think people and PA it's not a new profession, but I think it's gained a lot of popularity. And I think that people are starting to realize how to utilize them properly within the healthcare ecosystem. And I think a lot of times, years and years ago, and maybe you experience this too, is that a lot of people see it like as it was titled, like they were the assistant to the physician. And now people are pushing back on that saying, hey, wait a minute, right? Like if you're utilizing them and they're in the clinic so that the physician can be in the OR or doing whatever, well, then it's making everybody richer, right? It's making the physician richer. It's making the practice richer to be able to have that. And I think that a lot of people forever, like nurses or NPs, are just more of a well-known entity. So there's been more avocation. There's been more, like as you're saying, laws around them being able to have more autonomy. And I hope that it continues to sway that way for PAs. I mean, I see a lot of stuff happening now, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out over the next couple of years. And then also to see with, like you were saying, the tenure of people that have been in roles for 20 years versus those that hop around, if there is some type of data or way to measure like the clinical competencies between those two differentials, right? Like, do you
Yeah.
have a greater chance of moving into leadership if you've been with a company for X amount of years, or are you better off switching into leadership from a different company based on X amount of years? And obviously there's not enough data to surround or support that, but
Right. No, I think I think that the way healthcare is moving is we need to continue to have, obviously, healthcare leaders that have a clinical background,
yes.
whether it's nursing, whether it's PAs, or whether it's physicians.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, in my opinion, we need to make sure that we have people with clinical backgrounds and the appropriate clinical backgrounds at the table.
Yeah.
Because we're moving into, in a lot of it is coming full circle again. The payers have always been, the ones that tend to control a lot of what we do in healthcare, whether it's through,
Mm-hmm.
legislation, or whether it's actually through, contracts that organizations and groups can make with the payers, the commercial payers. Right. And obviously CMS drives some of that. But I think that in order for especially in hospitals and in different states, we have to continue advocating for ourselves. And I would like to see us, and I think we're getting better at this, I would like to see us to join together as opposed to
pitting against each other.
Being against each other, because I think that in the end, our goal as clinicians is to help people, treat people, mm-hmm. make them better, make lives better, whatever catchphrase you want to use.
Right.
That's why I got into medicine, was to help people and make them better. Mm-hmm. But I think that we would be doing a disservice if we just continue to accept the status quo and we continue to say, that's just the way it's always been. I think that's the way we've always done it. People will tell you that that's the most dangerous phrase in the English language.
Yes, it is.
And I would say that we've got to continue to push our legislatures. We've got to continue to push the payers. We've got to continue and we need the backing of our patients. And so I'm not advocating for folks to get political in their own practice. But what I think what we should do is there are going to be a few people that will get, political. We're seeing more and more either a PA or a doctor, being part of either state legislatures or the federal legislature. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. But you can join a group, whether it's American College of Healthcare Executives as a clinician, you can join them. Where, your local chapter, you can join local chapters of your particular organization. Find an organization that has both PAs and nurse practitioners that want to do things together and work together mm-hmm. to continue to enhance it.
100%.
But yeah, I think that's the next step that we got to get to.
Yeah,
we're getting better at it, but I think we got to continue to broaden on it. For sure.
There's still that ever-growing fight of NPs versus PAs. It's funny.
Oh, totally. Yeah, and I mean, we unfortunately do some of it to ourselves when we, try to take on the physicians. I mean, it
Yeah.
that never goes over very well.
Mm-mm.
And, there'll be some people that'll say, well, he's completely off base with that. Well, maybe, but I think we need to look at it from a standpoint of, I'm not saying that I don't have a role as a PA in the healthcare spectrum, but I will tell you that there are some things as a PA I cannot do that require a physician's
Yeah.
expertise. It requires
Sure.
the amount of training that they had. It requires it requires them to be a part of that patient's ride through the healthcare system.
Yeah.
But can I do maybe 70% of what a physician does? 75, 85? I don't know. It all depends on what my training is and what specialty I'm in.
Right.
But
Potentially. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
but I do think that, so I do think we have both NPs and PAs have a niche.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we try to take too many bites of the apple, in my opinion, and
Yeah.
think that we could do 100% of it. And I'm not sure that that's the right way for us to go.
No, no. And I laugh when people are like, they're trying to take over the MDs. I'm like, no, they're not. They're not trying to take over the physician spot.
I think that, there are some that think they can. Just to be quite honest.
Yeah.
I think there are some
they're never going to be able to.
that think they can. And there are some states that allow it. I mean, even here in North Carolina, PAs can own their own practice. I have a good friend of mine. She owns a psychiatric practice, and she practices very independently. But she's got a niche, and she has certain types of patients that she sees and she takes care of. And I think that's completely appropriate.
Right.
Should she be seeing all psychiatric patients? I think she would tell you no, that she doesn't think that that's the case. Right. But she still has a physician that she can ask questions to and have that expertise. So yeah,
you wouldn't be doing, and I think maybe I'm thinking of it from this. My perception is because we work with a lot of orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, people that are doing very intense things, that it's like no PA is saying, yeah, I'll handle that that surgery by myself. Like,
right.
No. So that's where I think maybe you see more of it in family medicine, primary care, things like that, where the scope of practice sometimes gets blurry in terms of what people's intentions are, what they want. But yeah, I remember my first time seeing the doctor of medical science. I was like, so does this change the scope of practice for PAs? And they're like, no. I said, okay. Thanks for the information.
And in some cases, it doesn't even change your pay. So, that's
exactly.
it may change it by, a few bucks. And,
right.
I'm not knocking anyone who goes and gets their doctorate as a PA by all means. I mean, I obviously went back to school and have done things, on top of being a PA, but I don't think it was broken before. I'm just trying to figure out why we tried to fix it. I'll just leave it like that.
Yeah. And I would argue too, that if you're wanting more of a leadership role, that the doctor in medical science might strengthen you from a clinical standpoint, because that's kind of what they told me. I said, okay, so then why would somebody be motivated to get this? They said, oh, to be a better clinician. I said, okay.
Yeah. I mean, some of them want to go on and teach. I mean, some teaching institutions require that you have a doctorate. I think that that's a very worthwhile reason to get it.
Sure.
And again, I mean, some of my colleagues have it, and I'm not knocking them at all. Some of them get it in leadership. And I think that, if you want to be a better healthcare leader, maybe you again, going into working in different organizations to be a potential lobbyist or lobby for, healthcare change, 100%. I think it adds validity to you as a clinician to say, hey, I have a doctorate in this. I've spent a great deal of time in my life, understanding this and studying this. And this is why I feel this way, and why I feel like that I can, probably give my opinion to you about this. But, just to be able to practice, general medicine necessarily, it's up to that individual and how they want to do it. But, I'm definitely not going to knock it. It's just not something that I decided to just go a different path. So.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome, cool. This has been a great conversation. I think it's shed a lot of insight for people who maybe are looking to grow within their organization or figure out if they want to take more of a split approach to being in leadership and also still practicing as a clinician. And then all the different rabbit holes that we went down, which were fun to talk about. So I really appreciate your time. And anybody that's listening to this too, Paul made mention of it, they're hiring a VP of operations. So if maybe you qualify for that type of role or would like to talk to him, feel free to reach out. But outside of that, I really appreciate your time, Paul. And we'll have to have you back to talk more because it sounds like we could talk for probably another 3 hours about all this.
Oh, totally. Well, listen, I really appreciate, Madison, your podcast. I think that you bring a great service to the healthcare organization. So keep up the great work with this. And honestly, it was a pleasure, honored to be on the podcast. And I apologize if I happened to say something that may have offended anyone out there, not meant to. But honestly, I think, to all my PA and nurse practitioner colleagues and healthcare colleagues, thank you all for being, there for me when I needed as a mentor to me. And I want to be able to give back. So if any of your viewers are listening, I'm more than happy to set up some time to meet with them and talk with them a little bit about my journey and greater detail and offline. So by all means, happy to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd love to come back if you ever, whenever you get to that point.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I'll link your LinkedIn so that if anybody's listening, you can just go right to the show notes and connect with him there. But until next time, appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Madison. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Healthy Careers Podcast, where we provide a platform for you to ask hard questions and get real answers. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more episodes every other Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern.